Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. Hello, I'm Elena Bose, your host. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Clare Pooley about her latest novel, How to Age Disgracefully. This is Clare's third novel. Her first book was a memoir called The Sober Diaries, about the year Clare gave up drinking, and was described as Bridget Jones Dries Out. Her debut novel, The Authenticity Project, was inspired by Clare's experience of exposing the grubby truth of her seemingly perfect life. It's been published in 32 languages, was a BBC Radio 2 book club pick, and a New York Times bestseller. Then came two more novels, all very successful and all raising issues dear to Clare's heart. Today, she talks to me about why she writes, how she went from being addicted to alcohol to being addicted to writing, a much healthier obsession. Clare touches on ageism. Who thinks you have to be boring and lonely when you're old? Menopause and getting your mojo back. Philandering husbands. Empty nest. All those fun things that many of us are familiar with. And if you like dogs, so does Clare. Each of her novels has one. Clare thinks you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat a dog. I once had a boyfriend who wasn't very nice to my pug, Antoinette. He said he liked dogs, but my pug wasn't a dog. That should have been red flag numero uno. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Clare. I'm thrilled we get to speak today about your latest novel, How to Age Disgracefully, an uplifting, hysterical read with lovable characters who say funny things or think funny thoughts all the time. People magazine called your book an uproarious romp. It's a crazy story of seniors, toddlers, a teenage single dad, a kleptomaniac, a yarn bomber, and a mutt named Maggie Thatcher, who somehow all come together to save their community center in Hammersmith in London. You tackle myths about old people being boring and despondent, show how menopausal women can get their mojo back. You show how friendships with people younger and older can be life-enhancing, and the importance of finding your own community. You do this all in a light, never preachy, often funny way that leaves readers, or at least this reader, feeling a bit better about the world. Can you tell us about your inspirations for writing this particular book?
Wow, that was such a great summary. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think the main inspiration for the book came because I turned 55 and I realized that I am closer to 60 than 50. And yet, I don't feel any different from the way I felt when I was in my 20s. And I don't imagine that when I'm in my 70s, I'm going to feel very different either. And I was slightly fed up with the way that in film and TV and novels, the older generation are so often typecast. I mean, usually characters who are in their 70s and above are sort of bit parts, and they're depicted as people who are hopeless with technology, at sea in the modern world, a bit sad and lonely, and they're generally saved by the younger generation. And, I thought, well, actually, I want to see older characters who are bossing it, who are using the wisdom that they've accumulated and are actually teaching the younger generation how to navigate the world rather than vice versa. So that was sort of where it started from. And then in addition to that, I started seeing a number of newspaper reports and TV programs about these centres in the Netherlands where they combine senior care and nursery care. And apparently it works incredibly well, having sort of the seniors and these toddlers sort of in the same space. And I thought, oh, now that would be a fun thing to happen in a novel. And the final thing is I heard this great sort of story about this very famous jewelry raid in Hatton Garden in London. about, I can't remember exactly when it was, about 10, 15 years ago, where all the culprits were in their 70s and above. And it just I just thought, wouldn't it be fun to take a group of senior citizens, mix them with a group of younger people and give them very naughty backstories.
I love it. I love it. And I did read about the Hatton Garden heist.
Yes, that's right.
You said something about how, you could use the invisibility of being a senior to your advantage.
Yes. It's, when I think, when you get past about the age of 50, particularly as a woman, you do start feeling like you're a bit invisible. And that makes me really cross, but it suddenly struck me that there are real advantages to invisibility because you can sort of sneak under the radar. So one of my main characters, actually my favorite character, is called Daphne. And we, at the beginning of the book, we just know that she is sort of mysteriously wealthy. We don't know where she gets her money from. We don't know why she's been sort of in hiding for 15 years. And gradually, we discover her backstory. And let's say she's not been entirely good her whole life. But who has by the time they get to 70, hey?
Exactly. Now, this is your third novel, the first two being runaway successes, as I'm sure this one will be. Book number 1, The Authenticity Project, was translated into 32 languages. You wrote that, I think, in your late 40s? Maybe?
Yes. Well, actually, it was published when I was 50. Yeah.
Okay. Amazing. Book number 2, Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting, I loved, and I interviewed you about that in 2022. And then now How to Age Disgracefully. Can you briefly tell us about the path that led you to become a novelist at age 50, basically?
Oh, yeah. I also have a rather interesting backstory because when I was younger, I dreamed of being a novelist. I mean, from the moment I discovered stories, I wanted to be able to write them. That was my great dream. But, life gets in the way. I worked in advertising for 20 years. I wrote nothing apart from PowerPoint presentations and emails and shopping lists. So, and then I got to the point, and this was in 2015, I got to the point where I realized that my life was sort of going seriously off track because I had picked up a major dependency on alcohol, and my wine o'clock habit was sort of completely out of control. I was drinking, it's rather embarrassing, but I was drinking about 15 bottles of wine, 10 bottles of wine a week, which is way too much. I mean, that's sort of way over the government guidelines, and it was having all sorts of impacts on my life. So I knew I had to quit drinking, but I was too embarrassed and ashamed about the situation I found myself in to talk to anybody about it. I didn't talk to my doctor. I didn't talk to my husband. I didn't talk to my friends. What I did do, because I needed some form of therapy, was I started an anonymous blog, and I called it Mummy Was a Secret Drinker. And I wrote in that blog every day. I wrote about what I was going through and all the research I'd been doing and how I was feeling. And that blog went viral and then became a memoir called The Sober Diaries, which was published at the beginning of 2018. And by this stage, to cut a long story short, by this stage, my new addiction was writing. And I really didn't want to stop writing. I absolutely loved it. But I didn't want to carry on writing about my own life. So I thought I'll try writing about imaginary people instead. And that became my whole new career.
Amazing. And then the Authenticity Project, how did you get the idea for that book? That was your first one. So that's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was probably the most autobiographical of my novels. I think many writers start off with their first novel being sort of most closely tied to their own lives. And the Authenticity Project really was about what happens when strangers tell the truth about their lives and the impact that has on other people and how it can create a sort of real community, which effectively is exactly what happened when I started blogging. So I told the real truth about my life, which is very different from what people saw on my social media or, saw at the school gate or whatever. And doing that sort of brought a whole community of people together, and it changed all of our lives for the better, which is really exactly what happens with the Authenticity Project. And one of the characters in the Authenticity Project, Hazard, is an alcohol and cocaine addict. So his story mirrors mine to an extent. So that was where that one came from.
Perfect. Thank you. You wrote a wonderful blog about how author Annie Lamott's book, Bird by Bird, motivated you to keep writing that first book. In a nutshell, for those who haven't read Annie's book, can you explain how it applies to so many challenges in life, not just writing, maybe not even just drinking?
Yes, I mean, I love that book. And funnily enough, actually, Annie Lamott doesn't drink either. She quit drinking many years ago. And she writes the expression bird by bird comes from a story from her childhood where her little brother had a complete meltdown one evening because he suddenly realized that he had a school project to hand in the next day and he hadn't done any of it. And he was supposed to have spent, the previous semester working on this project, which he hadn't even started. And it was a project about birds. And he was supposed to cover 20, 30 different birds. And he was completely beside himself, in floods of tears. And he said to his father, I can't do it. This is the end of my school career. I'm going to be in such trouble. And his father sat him down. He said, now don't panic. We'll just take it bird by bird, buddy. And they did, they took it bird by bird. And by the end of the night, they had a whole project on birds to hand in. And, she talks about how writing a novel is very much like that. If you worry about, having to produce 80, 90, 100,000 words, the whole thing can seem overwhelming. But actually, if you just think about each page, each chapter, or even each paragraph, you just take it bird by bird, within a relatively short period of time, you find that you've got a whole novel. And giving up alcohol is absolutely about bird by bird. So, the Alcoholics Anonymous expression of one day at a time, is absolutely what gets you through addiction. If you worry about, can I stop drinking forever? You'll never even take the first step. If you think, can I stop drinking just for today? The answer to that is always yes. Can I just write about one bird? Yes, of course you can. If you write about one bird enough times, you've got a whole project. If you write one chapter enough times, you've got a whole novel. Yeah. If you have one day without drinking enough times, you've been sober for a decade.
It's very good. It's a really good lesson, just sort of living in the now and breaking things down to just one little task that you can keep on doing, and then you've accomplished whatever it is that you need to accomplish, but rather than thinking of this humongous project. I like it. I think I have on my computer, I have a Post-it that says bird by bird, buddy.
Oh,
I
brilliant.
love that book.
Yeah, well, it's really good for teenagers as well. If you have, young people in your life who are struggling, just saying to them, look, can you make it through till the end of tomorrow? And if you can do that, you can make it through to the end of the following day and the end of the day after that. It just helps the whole world stop feeling overwhelming.
Do you know anyone like Daphne, your principal character, who at age 70 is sharp, chic, feisty, opinionated, and as witty as they come, an original with a fabulous checkered past? I want to be Daphne when I grow up, but are there people you modeled her after?
Well, really, she's modeled after the sort of woman I want to be when I'm 70. So she isn't modeled after any one particular person, but she's modeled after sort of, I guess, an amalgamation of characteristics that, that I found aspirational. But no, actually, when you think about it, Daphne is, particularly at the beginning of the book, she's not really a very nice person. She's very spiky. She doesn't like other people. She's very critical of everybody else around her. And, she doesn't have any friends at the beginning. And she thinks she's sort of slightly better than everyone else. She's not, in many ways, you wouldn't want to know somebody like Daphne. And I guess what I wanted to explore is the fact that, even the most unlikable people in the right circumstances can be magnificent. And by the end, I think everybody is rooting for Daphne and she's absolutely great. But it's not where she starts off. She's certainly not perfect. But I think the most interesting people aren't perfect.
No, that's true. And I liked even at the beginning when she was unpleasant and snooty and unfriendly, she was always funny and and had a plan and was confident about that she was doing things the right way. I don't know. I never felt sorry for her.
No. And I'm really pleased about that, because that was exactly what I wanted to avoid. I think often with older characters in novels, you are encouraged to feel pity for them. And I didn't want anyone to pity my characters. As I said, not all of them they're often in quite precarious situations, and they're not, always the nicest people, but certainly I don't think you pity them because they've all got agency. I mean, one of the examples I liked about Daphne is that she does yoga and Pilates every day, and she's very strong for her age, and she carries a walking stick, not because she needs a walking stick to walk with, but because she uses it as a weapon and she uses it to clear people out of her way if necessary. So, I like the way that she subverts the stereotypes.
Exactly. I love that too. When timid menopausal Lydia takes over the senior center, she suggests they could play bingo, bridge, or maybe even just sing. The elderly group suggests otherwise. What about skydiving, they say, target practice, speed dating, karate? I loved all that. So what other stereotypes are high on your list, maybe besides ageism?
Well, there's several that, I've tackled in previous novels as well as this one. So, I find actually that, I started writing fiction I started writing nonfiction as a form of therapy. And when I moved into fiction, I still write as therapy. So I still write about the things that make me angry and things that I want to change and things that I want to understand. So, ageism is one of those things. Addiction is another. And there are so many stereotypes around addiction that, that are absolutely sort of ingrained in people's sort of psyche. Sexism, I've tackled. And actually, there's a great line of Daphne's where she talks about how she's gone from the frying pan of sexism into the fire of ageism. So yes, I mean, I think there are, and with Lydia, she's dealing with the menopause, the empty nest, all sorts of, all sorts of things that we tend to sort of stereotype and,
Yep. Moving on to canines, dog names. The one in this book is called Maggie Thatcher. And in your first book, it was Keith. I don't remember if there was a dog in Iona.
There was. Iona had a dog called Lulu who went on the train with her every day.
Of course she did. Of course she did, who sat on the train next to her. And no one better try to take Lulu's seat. Of course she did. Do you have a lot of fun choosing dog names? And what extra element do dogs bring to a book that humans might not?
Oh, a great question. I mean, I think dogs are really important in books, actually, because, they do all sorts of things. I think the way that people react to a dog says a lot about them. And the way, so with this book, with Maggie Thatcher, she's looked after by 3 of the different characters who sort of adopt her, and they take turns looking after her. And the different ways they look after her, I think, says a huge amount about them. So that was great fun to play with. So, for instance, Maggie Thatcher, the reason I chose that name is because, the 3 characters that adopt Maggie Thatcher are not fans of the original Maggie Thatcher, and they all call her different variations of her name. So one calls her Maggie, one calls her M, another one calls her Margaret. So they can't even agree on her name, let alone what to feed her or what the rules are about sitting on the furniture and that sort of thing. So I think, dog is a great, I think having a world without dogs would be very sad. And, I have to live with this imaginary world in my head for 2 years. And so I wanted to have a dog in it. So it's a very selfish thing. I like my worlds to have dogs in. Oh, but I must tell you a story about Keith from the Authenticity Project, because Keith, try not to give away too many spoilers, but at the end of the Authenticity Project, he's left in a slightly precarious situation. And I can't tell you how many messages via social media or email from readers saying how upset they were about Keith, and they needed to know whether Keith was okay. And, people were really, I had people saying, I can't sleep because I'm worried about Keith. And, and I wrote back to everybody saying, don't worry about Keith. And I told them what happened to Keith and, the fact that he was okay. And then I asked my editors on both sides of the Atlantic whether when they did the next reprint, they could include in the author's note a paragraph explaining what happened to Keith. So now I get far fewer messages from people about Keith. So it just goes to show that I think readers care as much about dogs as I do.
Yeah. Well, I'm a dog person, so I'm very happy that you have dogs in your book. They say they're man's best friend, and they really are, because they never argue.
Yes.
They listen. They're loyal. They have so many virtues.
Yeah.
The writing process. You quote a fellow author referring to the point when the author becomes the character's PA, how when the words flow, it's like taking dictation. How quickly does that happen to you when you're working on a novel?
Oh God! You're never entirely sure that it will. There's that sort of magical turning point when your characters go from feeling very awkward and wooden and two-dimensional, and you're telling them constantly what to say and what to do, and it feels like really hard work. And then suddenly, if you're lucky, and as I said, you're never quite convinced that it is going to happen, they start improvising. And at that point, you're just writing down what they're doing. And it's the most magical thing when it happens, if it happens. And for me, it takes at least 3 months before I get to that point. And it's often at the point just where you think, and I have that conversation with my agent where I go, this isn't working, I'm going to have to throw it away and start again. And she goes, no, let's not be too hasty. And at that point, often things start to change. It's just when you start to despair, I find. It's funny, I listened to this great quote by Frederick Backman. He did a fabulous talk in the US, and it's on YouTube. If you Google Frederick Backman, and it's called Creative Anxiety, and it's only about 5 minutes long. So it's like really quick to listen to, but it's absolutely hilariously funny. And he says that the being a novelist is the best way he can think of to get paid for being insane. and it does feel like that sometimes. When you spend your whole life in an imaginary world talking to imaginary people and then thinking that they are talking through you and you're just some sort of PA, it makes you feel insane. I mean, insane in a good way, but totally insane.
How fun. Sounds very fun. Writing a book requires deep reserves of energy. What do you do to prepare?
Oh, good question. I like to get away. So I live in London, and I love London. I get a lot of creative energy from London because, it's filled with people of all nationalities, all ages, all types. It's, the food is really varied and eclectic. It has an amazing theatre scene, cinema, art, so in terms of filling that well of creativity, London is the most amazing place. But London can make you feel depleted of energy sometimes because it's so full on, it can be exhausting. So I like to get away just at the beginning of the sort of writing process. And my favorite place to go is Cornwall, which is right down in the southwest of the country. And it has the most incredible beaches, and just scenery. And it's just one of the most beautiful places on earth. And I like to go and swim in the sea any time of year, which actually in January, February in Cornwall is very, very cold. And yeah, that fills my energy reserves. I like to be sort of, out in the wild. And funny enough, I couldn't live out in the wild forever. I like the contrast between city and wildness. That's what gives me my reserves.
And your books take place mainly in the cities, right?
Yeah.
Not out there, but that's where you sort of, it makes sense. I agree. I like the contrast, but I can see how the cities will provide you with, there's so much creative energy in London.
Yeah. And I think, one of my great inspirations was Armistead Maupain's Tales of the City.
I'm from San Francisco,
and he wrote about
originally.
1970s San Francisco. Yeah. And if you remember, the sort of, those books were set around a boarding house that was sort of owned by Mrs. Madrigal. And that house brought together a really sort of eclectic group of people who became very firm friends. And I think somewhere that series sort of lodged in my subconscious, because, that's what I love to do, is to take people in a city who are very different ages, different backgrounds, different types, and somehow bring them together in a way that creates an extraordinary sort of alchemy. That's, I think, what all three of my novels have in common.
Yeah, and it's great. And it provides for a lot of humor, or moments where you can have a lot of humor. I love asking authors what they would be doing if they weren't an author. But somebody else beat me to it with you. I saw that you said in an interview, if I wasn't an author, I'd love to be a witch. Can you explain?
I've forgotten that I said that. Yeah, I love books about witchcraft. So I don't know if you read Wayward yet by Amelia. Is it Amelia Hart? I think so.
I haven't, but I plan to, because you loved it, didn't you?
Yeah. So it's a great book, and it's about 3 generations of witches. And I'm fascinated by things like the Crucible and, the stories of the Salem witch trials. And we had in the UK, so many witch trials over the sort of, the medieval times, etc. And, I'm fascinated by that whole sort of witchy thing. So my favorite, my little party trick is I will read people's palms, or I'll do tarot cards, and I have no idea whether there's anything in it, but it's fun. And so I would love to be a witch.
I love it. Okay. And then you said something in your book that I need you to expand on too. Never trust a yucca, or is it yucca? A yucca plant? Why not?
You know what? It's funny when you create characters. I always start from thinking, I don't start from thinking, what is this person good at? I start with thinking, what does this person struggle with? What do they find really hard? What's their fatal flaw? And I start from that. And then I sort of add these little layers and details over time, and they become more and more and more three-dimensional and interesting. Daphne, one of her little quirks is she talks to her plants. And I don't know where the yucca thing came from, but I thought actually she's a sort of person who would take against a particular plant just because she herself is quite spiky. And, she is not the sort of person that would treat all plants the same. And I thought, if she was to take against a plant, which plant would it be? I remembered when I was a teenager, I had this yucca plant, which is sort of like a desert plant. It has a, trunk and very green, spiky leaves. And they're almost impossible to kill, yucca plants, which is why I had one. And I managed to keep it alive for a number of years. And I thought it'd be quite fun if Daphne just didn't entirely trust her yucca plant. So on a number of points during the book, she talks about don't trust the yucca. I don't know quite where some of these details come from, but as you get the big things sorted, like where somebody is born, how old they are, where they live, that sort of thing, and then some of those little details like their relationship with their yucca plant as some of the sort of, there's like the icing on the cake sort of towards the end of the process, I think.
And it kind of makes sense. She's very spiky and they're impossible to kill and they're not very cozy.
I think it is that impossible to kill thing, if it's sort of, what is it really a plant if it's so indestructible?
Exactly. One last thing you mentioned is, I read this somewhere, that you, I guess in your notes, maybe for the Authenticity Project or Sober Diaries, you thanked your husband so much that he now has a Facebook page. Is it in relation to you, his Facebook page? Like Clare Pooley's husband?
It's actually not, it's not a page. It's so when I wrote the Sober Diaries, my husband features in it a lot because it's autobiography, it's a memoir, it's a year of my life, and he is very much in it. He is throughout this whole book. My husband appears. And I'm very nice about him in this book, possibly too nice about him, So I'm, he comes across as a hero. I mean, he is a hero, and he particularly was a hero in that year where I was dealing with addiction and then breast cancer, and we had 3 small kids, and he was great.
Yeah.
So I was lovely about him in this book. And every now and again, I'll be scrolling through Facebook and I'll see somebody reviewing the Sober Diaries, and then there will be this discussion underneath, with people who've read it. And I was doing this once, and I saw, I don't know who it was that posted this review. It was very nice. And the discussion underneath went, wasn't her husband dreamy? I wish I was married to somebody like that. and this went on with everybody chipping in about how gorgeous and lovely my husband was and why I showed him. And he was so thrilled. And I really wanted to reply and say, actually, he's not always that great. But I didn't. So he does have a fan club on Facebook, but not his own page. Maybe we should create one.
maybe that your next book or the next one after the one you're working on now could set them straight. And tell us, in the next book, I know you probably don't want to talk about it because maybe it's too early, but are we likely to see stereotypes dealt with there? Or any clues at all?
Yes, funny enough, yes. But a completely different sort of stereotype, and a different age group, and I mean, I'm at that really scary stage though, where I've written about 20% of it, and I've sent it to my editors to check whether they're happy with the way it's going, and now I'm waiting to hear back. So as a result, I feel I really can't talk about it because I have thrown a whole book in the bin. Between the Authenticity Project and Iona Iverson, I wrote a whole separate novel. It took me a year, and I threw it in the bin. So I don't really, I worry about jinxing it.
Yeah, don't jinx it. Don't jinx it, because I want to be interviewing you again in 2 years' time.
Oh, thank
about
you.
2 years. Well, thank you.
Yeah, it will be 2 years.
Well, I absolutely adored this. And I need to read the Authenticity because I adored Iona Iverson. And you just, your characters are so, you just want to be them. I love them, especially.
Oh, thank you.
Especially your main character as well, especially Iona. I mean, the other ones are all great, but they really are the stars of the show. They're fabulous.
Yeah, it's funny. I was telling somebody that I don't know how authors can write things like psychological thrillers or horror or, sort of extreme crime novels, because living with those sorts of characters in my head, I would find really disturbing and really hard, because, the characters I create, I carry them around with me for 2 years. And even after that, I find it difficult to let them go. They're still there somewhere. And I have to really like them. I have to know them really well, and I have to really like them for them to be able to take up that headspace. So I'm glad you like them too.
Yeah. No, I can see that. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you've got to like them because you're living with them for 2 years. And I agree with you.
And imagine if you had an axe murderer in your head. What does that do to you?
Says a little bit about the author, possibly, but we don't need to go there. Thank you for listening to Elena Meets the Author. I only interview authors if I like their books. Life's too short. Next up will be a spy thriller set in Cap Ferret, a sandy peninsula in southwestern France that I love. But my friends with the house there don't want me to talk about it, so it doesn't get spoiled. So forget I said anything about that place, which shall go unnamed. Please do message me with book recommendations or questions you'd like me to ask. See you next time.